Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be digging into some fascinating military strategy, and I got to say, given your line of work, this one might be particularly interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're going back to the classics with this one. We're going to be looking at On War by Carl von Clausewitz. Now, this was a Prussian general way back in the 19th century, really a true military theorist. And his ideas, they're still studied today, still debated in war colleges even now.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much those strategic principles, they really have stood the test of time. And today we're zeroing in on chapter 16 of book 5, where Clausewitz, he really tackles a topic that, it's really the backbone of any military campaign, those lines of communication.
He gets into it too, the nuts and bolts of it all, how to establish those lines, how to protect them, and even, how to exploit your enemy's vulnerabilities when it comes to their own lines of communication. It's all in there.
And he makes a really interesting point right off the bat. He says that these lines, they have this like double significance. They're not just about getting supplies to your troops, which you would think, right? But they could also, in a pinch, become escape routes.
Yeah, he was really ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it seems almost counterintuitive though, right? The same route that you're using to supply your army, that's the same path that you might have to use to retreat.
It is. It's a fascinating duality, and Clausewitz was really highlighting how that creates this inherent strategic vulnerability. Just think about it. You've got a constant flow of food, ammunition, reinforcements, all the essentials. They have to flow through these channels, these lines, right? But if the enemy, if they're able to cut those lines to gain a foothold somewhere along that route, it becomes this, well, this Achilles heel.
Yeah, you're making it crystal clear. So even back then, securing those lines of communication, it was absolutely essential. And Clausewitz, he was writing at a time when if you disrupted those lines, that could be a decisive blow, right? You could cripple an entire campaign. But my question is, with all the advancements we've seen in modern warfare, with technology, has that fundamental reality changed? Are those lines still that important?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer, as with most things in warfare, isn't so simple. On the one hand, you're right. We have advanced transportation, sophisticated logistics. We're even seeing like drone delivery in some cases.
That's crazy, right?
It is. It's amazing. But those lines, they are still very much a lifeline for any military force.
So those lines are still a lifeline, even today.
Without a doubt. Take, for example, what we're seeing right now in the conflict in Ukraine. Russia's logistical struggles, they've been well documented. Their ability to effectively get supplies to the front lines, it's been a real challenge, and it's had a huge impact on their operations.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that makes it pretty real, pretty contemporary.
Yeah.
So clearly, those principles that Clausewitz was talking about, they still apply. And he was big on talking about the difference between waging war on your home turf, operating within your own territory versus, being on hostile ground. He argued that having that local support or lacking it could make or break those communication lines. What do you make of that?
He was spot on, as usual. Think about it. Operating from your own territory, you have those built-in advantages. You have a supportive population, at least ideally. You have established infrastructure. You're familiar with the terrain. All those factors, they make it so much easier to secure those supply routes, to keep those lifelines open.
Sure, it's familiar grounds, right?
Exactly.
But when you're fighting on hostile ground, it's got to be a completely different ballgame. You're fighting an uphill battle in many ways.
Absolutely. Suddenly, you're dealing with unfamiliar territory, potentially hostile locals. You have that constant threat of sabotage, of attack on your supply lines. Just getting those lines established in the first place, that becomes a major challenge, let alone protecting them.
Right, and it's not just about brute force in that situation, is it? It seems like winning over the local population, getting them on your side, that would play a huge role in securing those lines.
100%. You've hit on a crucial point. Clausewitz understood that the human element, what we now call winning hearts and minds, that is absolutely essential, especially when you're operating in hostile territory. And we've seen this time and time again, from the Vietnam War to more recent conflicts. Even the most powerful military in the world, if the local population is actively working against them, it creates this vulnerability. Those supply lines, they've become incredibly difficult to maintain.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that successful warfare, it's not just about firepower and tactics. It's about understanding the human terrain, the political landscape, the whole picture.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, with all that said, when it comes to actually choosing those lines of communication in the first place, that seems like step one, right?
Absolutely.
Clausewitz, he lays out some really fascinating criteria that I think are worth exploring. He talks about the quality of roads, the population density, natural obstacles, the presence of fortresses. It's like he's putting together this, like, military logistics checklist.
And it's a checklist that, in many ways, is still relevant today.
It really is, yeah. I mean, he was laying out a framework for strategic thinking back then, and it's really quite remarkable how much of it still holds up today, even with all the advancements we've seen in, technology and modern warfare.
So you're telling me even back then, they were already thinking about things like terrain analysis, just like we do now? Oh, absolutely. Terrain analysis, it's as crucial as ever, even with all the modern tools we have at our disposal, satellite imagery, advanced mapping systems, you name it. But the fundamental questions, they remain the same. Can our vehicles handle this terrain? What kind of cover and concealment can we expect? Clausewitz, he couldn't have imagined drones, GPS, any of that. But that emphasis on understanding the physical landscape, it's as relevant as ever.
And what about his point on population centers? Because that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
That those would still be key factors in planning a military operation today.
You're spot on. Infrastructure, it's critical. Roads, bridges, ports, airfields, all those things Clausewitz talked about, they're just updated for the 21st century. But then you add in population density, and it introduces all these layers of complexity. Today's militaries, they have to factor in collateral damage, civilian casualties, and then there's the whole information age to consider. Everything's under a microscope. Warfare today, it's as much about like managing perceptions as it is about, controlling territory.
Yeah, it's almost as if the battle space itself has expanded. It's not just about the physical ground that you control. It's about the narrative, right? It's about the information war that's playing out alongside it.
Exactly, and that ties right back into Clausewitz's emphasis on those local political dynamics. Those are more crucial than ever these days. Military strategists, they have to consider international opinion, alliances, the potential for insurgencies. It's this whole complex web of factors, and those lines of communication, they run right through the middle of it all.
It sounds like planning a military operation today, it's like this high-stakes game of chess, but on a global scale with countless moving parts.
That's a great analogy. It
Yeah.
really highlights the strategic thinking that has to go into it. But anyway, let's say you've established those lines of communication, which is no easy feat in itself, right? The next big hurdle, it's protecting them. And Clausewitz, he talks about fortresses, local alliances, maintaining strict discipline within the ranks. And it all makes sense, but I'm curious, how have those methods of protection, how have they evolved in the modern era?
Well, I mean, the tools of the trade has certainly changed, but I imagine the fundamental objectives are largely the same, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you're right on the mark there. For example, we don't really see traditional fortresses so much anymore, but we've got modern equivalents. Think about air superiority. Controlling the airspace above those supply lines, that's essential for preventing enemy attacks, ensuring that those supplies and reinforcements, they can get through safely.
And in our, hyper-connected world, wouldn't cyber defense also be a major factor when it comes to protecting those lines of communication? That seems like it adds a whole other dimension to the equation.
Absolutely, yeah. Protecting your networks, communication systems, your command and control structures from cyber attacks. I mean, that is absolutely paramount in modern warfare. It's a dimension of warfare that, frankly, Clausewitz couldn't have even predicted. But that focus on security, on control, it's directly applicable to the digital age.
It's almost as if those lines of communication, they've like extended into the digital realm now, making cybersecurity just an integral part of any military strategy.
Precisely. And just as Clausewitz, he stressed the importance of discipline within the ranks, right? Today, that translates to things like operational security, information control, preventing leaks that could compromise those vital supply routes. It's about vigilance. It's about being smart, thinking several steps ahead of your enemy.
So it's not just about reacting to threats. It's about anticipating them.
Exactly, being proactive. And that brings us to another, I think, really insightful, even a little bit bold statement from Clausewitz. He says that only the side with the stronger lines of communication, only that side can effectively turn the enemy.
So you're saying it's not enough to just protect your own lines. You have to be able to exploit the weaknesses in the enemy's logistics too.
Exactly. That's the whole idea. If you can safeguard your own supply lines, right. But then at the same time, you're identifying and exploiting those vulnerabilities in your enemy's logistical operations. That's where you gain a real strategic advantage. You can dictate the pace of the conflict. You force your opponent to react to you instead of the other way around.
So you're basically turning their lifeline into a liability.
Exactly.
It makes me think of, you read about those historical examples where armies were crippled not just by direct attacks, but by being cut off from their supplies, right?
Mm.
Left stranded, no way to fight.
And those historical lessons, they hold true today. The
Yeah.
ability to anticipate, disrupt an enemy's logistical operations, I mean, that can be just as decisive, if not more so, than winning on the battlefield. It's a force multiplier.
It really is. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the dual nature of those lines of communication to the importance of logistics, even in our age of drones and advanced technology.
And we've seen how Clausewitz's ideas, though they were, rooted in 19th century warfare, they offer this really powerful framework for understanding these dynamics, even in the context of, modern military operations.
It really is remarkable how much his insights still resonate. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listener with something to ponder. We've talked about roads, bridges, railroads, those traditional lines of communication. But in our world today, everything's connected. So what about those non-traditional lines? What about global supply chains, cyber networks, the flow of information itself? Could those become the battlegrounds of the future, where control over those pathways, even though they're invisible, is just as crucial as controlling actual physical territory?
It's a question worth considering, for sure. I mean, the battles of the future, who's to say they won't be fought on those digital front lines, where securing data, protecting networks, ensuring the free flow of information, that becomes paramount. Clausewitz might not have envisioned the internet or the complexities of, our globalized world today, but his work, it gives us a lens. It's surprisingly relevant for viewing those emerging battle spaces.
Well, it's like he gave us this foundation for strategic thinking that we can apply to all these different challenges, even those way beyond the traditional battlefield.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for lending your expertise to this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well. Always happy to dig into Clausewitz.
And to our listeners, thank you for your service. We hope this deep dive is giving you something to, maybe think about, maybe apply in your own work. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning. We'll see you on our next deep dive.